Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the ISE webinar on apprenticeship reform, one in a suite of sessions that we've done on this really important topic. Apologies for the couple of minutes delay. We were just trying to sort some tech issues out in the background. I'm Anne-Marie Campion. I'm the Insights Manager for the ISE. I also lead on apprenticeships for the ISE. So this has been a key topic for us over a period of months. I think it's exactly a year since Skills England came into being, replacing iFate. I think it's been a year of quite considerable shifts in the apprenticeship landscape. And I'm really delighted to have three of our apprentice champions who are going to run this webinar with me today. I get each of them to introduce themselves as they come on camera and talk to you. But that's really to give us we build this as where are we now? As I say, it's been quite a tumultuous year. We've had a number of changes announced. At one point, it seemed to be that they were almost daily changes. Hopefully, we've entered a period of stability, but we'll see. We'll see maybe what happens after this week's by-election. But we are where we are now, and I'm delighted with our experts that they can talk you through their perspectives. We welcome your questions. I will field those towards the end of the webinar, but if you could post them in the Q&A section at the bottom, that would be great, because then I will manage those and direct those accordingly at our delegates. You're the delegates at our presenters, Gareth, Joel and Lorcan, but they'll say a little bit more about themselves as they appear on camera. So I'm going to hand over first, Gareth, to you, and I think I'm hopefully going to be managing your slides, and we'll see how that goes. But if you'd like to take it from here.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. I dream of stability, to be honest. I think it's fair to say the last couple of years, there's been a huge amount of change, huge amount of uncertainty, I think. This is what I spend my time doing now, and I've been working in my kind of role for sort of 30 years, and I've never known so many things changing at the same time, and in a lot of respects, so little clarity on where some of it's going to land, and unfortunately, some of bits of it impact other bits of it, and they kind of overlap and interrelate. So we're going to be hearing from Joel and Lorcan later on. They're going to bring the employer's perspective, but I'm going to kick off. So I'm a training provider, and I thought it would be useful for this webinar to just give an overview of kind of what's been going on and what is looming. It's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour, given the amount of change that's happening. So Anne-Marie, are you able to share my slides? I guess we can circulate these slides afterwards. So I'll rattle through and perhaps point out some of the sort of big things I think that are going on. So my name's Gareth John. So that's come up. Thank you, Anne-Marie. Fantastic. Cool. So I'm policy director with First Intuition. So we're a national provider of professional training. We've got 25 offices. We've just opened our 26th office actually in Newcastle. We provide a variety of things. I mean, our home turf really is accountancy apprenticeships from levels 2 to level 7. So I've been very much involved in those changes in the last few months. But we've also recently moved into areas like leadership and management and digital data and AI. So we're covering quite a broad range of areas. And because of that, kind of gives us a bit of insight into the various changes that are going on, and particularly how the employers we work with are reacting to some of them, which seem to be the most impactful kind of thing that then Lorcan and Joel will be able to tell us a bit later on. So if you can advance on a slide. So I thought it might be useful actually to set the scene really before we think about individual changes that are going on, and actually think about what ultimately is the government trying to achieve. So I thought we'd talk briefly just about overall government priorities. So hit the first click there, Anne-Marie. I mean, a real focus of the government. We've definitely moved. I mean, 2-3 years ago, we had what a lot of people described as a kind of all age, all level, all sector approach to skills, and particularly to apprenticeships. And we've definitely moved away from that. We're looking at a government that's far more directive, far more targeted with where they want to allocate funding and where they want to support. So, their key priority. You might remember when the Labour Party first won the general election nearly 2 years ago, they had 5 missions. I don't know if anyone remembers the 5 missions. Definitely, I think some of them have sort of gone into the shadows a bit, but the one they're still very, very focused on is economic growth. Because actually with economic growth, they hope they can then serve various other objectives and missions. So hopefully you're very aware, I'm sure, of the industrial strategy. So the IS 8+2, as I sometimes describe, the kind of key growth sectors, including the likes of defence, which you'll have seen in the news just in the last few days. I suspect it's going to get more focus now. Advanced manufacturing, from my perspective, training accountants, professional and business services. We've got financial services in there. And then there's the +2 effectively, which is not key growth sectors, but strategically important for the country, such as construction, health and care. So we've got a real focus on what's in the industrial strategy, obviously concerns around what's not in there. So things like hospitality and retail. Next click, Anne-Marie. So we've got a real focus on young people. You may well have seen the Milburn Review recently, the NEETs crisis, over 1 million NEETs at the moment. And the next click, we've got lower levels being a real priority, kind of career entry. So this, is really what the government wants to focus support on, as we'll see a bit later with some of the incentives being introduced. I think particularly you might be aware that apprenticeships and the Growth and Skills Levy changed from the Department for Education to DWP. I think has some positives. It gets skills out of the shadow of schools, which tends to take the real focus in DFE. DWP, my concerns there, though, is that they're kind of focused on getting people into the workplace. They're very focused on the NEETs crisis rather than focusing on people who are in the workplace. And obviously, there's a lot of mature workers. In fact, the vast bulk of taxpayers are probably more mature workers, and there's a concern that they may get overlooked. And next click, Anne-Marie, we've also got a real focus on SMEs and non-levy employers. They tend to be getting the support. I think the government's perspective is that levy payers have very deep pockets and can look after themselves. So that's a kind of, I guess, an overall context. On to the next slide, Anne-Marie, and the next click. In terms of context, I think the government, if you remember from even before the general election, they were talking a lot about flexibilities in the use of the apprenticeship levy. It was felt that the levy was just not flexible enough for an awful lot of employers. They couldn't spend it on what they wanted. And to be honest, I think the government has now saddled themselves with this word flexibility. Fortunately, you might even remember there was talk 2.5, 3 years ago about 50% of levy funds being used for flexible purposes. Now, fortunately, that didn't make it into the manifesto because they're struggling really at the moment to offer any sort of flexibilities. But the early flexibilities have really been within apprenticeship programs. You might remember that they shortened the minimum duration of apprenticeships from 12 months to 8 months back last August, I think it was. So they started by making apprenticeship programs themselves more flexible. Their next step is to introduce flexibilities effectively beyond apprenticeship programs. So foundation apprenticeships and kind of very hot topic in the last few weeks, apprenticeship units as being shorter courses that can be funded from the levy. Next click. Another issue, the government is clearly in a very tight fiscal situation, not going to be improved, I guess, by pressure now to spend more money on defence, as you'll probably have seen very recently. But in the last 2-3 years, the apprenticeship budget has essentially been fully spent. In fact, in the last year, I think it was 101% spent. So they had to find funds from other parts of government department budgets. So, they've not got a huge amount of money to play about. The next point there, then, that is forcing a lot of trade-offs. They're trying to deliver flexibilities in a very tight fiscal situation. That's creating trade-offs, some of which we'll talk about over the next few minutes. And next click. I think it's also going to be creating quite a lot of cliff edges. I think there's some really big differences now. Take non-levy versus levy, that threshold of 3 million annual payroll. If you're just below it, 2.9 odd million payroll, actually there's lots of support, lots of positives. If you click just over 3 million, actually all of a sudden that support drops away. And for reasons we'll see, some big increases in costs. Also, and I'm thinking about this from a level 7 perspective, I see a lot of employers recruiting young people from college and university into chartered accountancy training, often funded by level 7. Well, the difference now between a 21-year-old recruit who does qualify for level 7 funding and somebody who could be literally a few weeks older at 22 and therefore not eligible to level 7 funding, I worked out in the first year alone, that could be a £12,000 difference between the 21-year-old and the 22-year-old. That's pretty significant. Well, what about some of the actual changes? Well, if we click on to the next slide, Anne-Marie, I think we're seeing an awful lot around trade-offs. Because of the tight fiscal situation, the government, some of you will be aware of Simon Ashworth. He's talked on this sort of forum before. He talks a lot about be careful what you wish for, because anything they give with one hand, they're probably going to have to take elsewhere with the other hand. So we've seen a variety of both negatives and positives, and often these things are related. I'm a big believer, the restriction in funding for level 7 apprenticeships, I think, was introduced in part to allow them to offer foundation apprenticeships, freeing up budget to allow those new products. The streamlining, the defunding we've seen recently of 16 apprenticeship standards, I think that's because they want to then offer apprenticeship units. So they need to find budget somewhere. Unfortunately, Treasury, they're not releasing huge amounts of extra money into the apprenticeship budget. They are, releasing bits and pieces. I think one of the reassuring things is apprenticeships does seem to be an area the government are still keen to support. They have been adding to the budget to a degree in the last couple of years. That's not true of areas like boot camps and, the adult education budget. And in fact, some of these trade-offs actually have, as an example, the level 7 restriction that came in January, you can imagine drove a huge spike of sign-ups for level 7 at the end of last year. November, December, we saw huge numbers signing up onto various level 7s. That's obviously going to use up more budget. So I think that actually drove an acceleration of this defunding process that we've seen. They had to cut deeper because they knew they were going to be spending more money on level 7. Now, I've just sort of laid out the trade-off, some of the negatives and positives. We'll talk through some of them specifically over the next sort of 7 or 8 minutes. So if we can flick to the next slide, Anne-Marie, let's think through some of these negatives. Well, as I'm sure a lot of us are aware, level 7 funding restriction from the beginning of this year, only now for learners up to the age of 21. So as soon as they turn 22, they will not be eligible for the level 7 funding. That's going to affect a lot of graduates. You can imagine graduates who've had a gap year, graduates who've had a placement year, graduates who did a master's, went to a Scottish university. They are generally going to be at least 22 by the time they graduate. Worth being aware, actually, that there is a slightly higher age cap for care leavers or those with an education, health and care plan. And actually, there's a surprising number in that demographic because they've got up to the age of 24. So if they're below 25, then they can still get level 7 funding. And I was chatting to somebody at the DfE recently who reckoned there was probably 30,000 in that demographic of 22, 3 and 4 with those sorts of EHCPs. So that's definitely worth being aware of. I'll also just point out, they still have kept the door open. You can still have a privately funded level 7 apprenticeship if you've got learners who are 22 or above and aren't eligible for the funding. Why would you want to do that? Well, actually, the learner will still be eligible for the national insurance exemption. The employer's national insurance exemption is kind of one of the appeals of still signing somebody up to an apprenticeship at level 7, even if they're too old for the levy funding. The other major negative, if you want to click on, Anne-Marie, is this streamlining or defunding. So we saw 16 standards which will be defunded between about this autumn and the beginning of next year. No age issues there. It's just full defunding at all ages. Probably the big headlines were around the leadership management standards, the levels 3, 5 and 6 that are being defunded. The rationale from the government was that they were not occupationally specific enough. And so they felt that they're the sort of thing that employers would fund themselves. That's very debatable, I think. And interesting because a lot of the reports I've seen in recent months have pinpointed leadership and management skills as being some of the most needed and most lacking skills in organizations. So I think some real potential issues there. Big question, obviously, is will we see further streamlining? It's hard to say. I suspect we probably will do at some point. Although, again, trying to be positive with a negative, I'm aware that the department, when they were originally looking at streamlining, were planning to defund over 200 standards. So the fact it was only 16, I think, again, shows the fact they do fundamentally want to support apprenticeships. Well, what about some positives? Let's be a bit more upbeat. So on to the next slide. So, well, firstly, we saw that introduction of shorter duration apprenticeships, I think really relevant then to that level 7 piece. We see a lot of school leavers who'll come in at lower levels, maybe levels 3 and 4, with a view to moving to level 7 as a progression. And actually, the more efficiently you can get them through those lower levels, the better, to try and get them to level 7 before they hit their 22nd birthday. Another click, Anne-Marie. So another positives is the introduction of foundation apprenticeships. Again, the slides will be shared with all the details here if you haven't come across these, but these are designed to be level 2 programs to kind of prepare young people for the workplace. Variety of areas that they were originally launched in haven't been hugely successful, not seen huge amounts of take up. I think in the August to October quarter, towards the end of last year, they only had 40 starts in total across 3 months across all of those foundation apprenticeships. So I think the general view is that they're just too long, because they still have the usual 8-month minimum that any other apprenticeship has. Next positive, Anne-Marie, probably much more interesting, I think, is the apprenticeship units. These short courses that are being introduced can be as little as a couple of weeks. Now, they've launched 10 apprenticeship units back in April. The one that everyone seems to be talking about are the 3 apprenticeship units covering AI leadership. Definitely some, interest in these, but actually there are some major challenges. The funding rates are pretty low. I think they translate at around about £25 per hour per learner, which, if you're trying to teach AI leadership, can you imagine the kind of tutor you probably want teaching AI leaders? I'm not sure you're going to get many of them at the kind of £25 per delegate. The fact that the department has said they can defund these with 4 weeks notice, is not ideal either. Doesn't give providers or employers much certainty that, if these things are actually successful, there's an affordability issue and maybe the government will cut them quite quickly. The funding model is not ideal. 70% of the funding doesn't get received by the provider till the end of the program. That's quite risky for them. And actually the delivery model, the fact that they have to be fully asynchronous. I mean, those AI leadership units, for instance, you're looking at 30 hours of live delivery for a senior leader in an organization. That's like, a week of their time they're going to be out of the workplace, which I think is a challenge. Next slide, Anne-Marie. Let's rattle through a few more points before I finish off. Now, again, we'll circulate these with all of the employer incentives. I thought I'd use this as a nice overview of pretty much everything that's available. Don't forget the existing incentives, so particularly the NI exemption, the employer's NI exemption, where apprentices are below 25. I think that's very valuable to a lot of employers. You might also be aware of that age incentive for younger. And in fact, you can see that these are all pretty much age related, back to those overall priorities. But next click, Anne-Marie, we've got some new incentives, particularly about tackling the NEET issue. So you've got the Youth Jobs Grant, Youth Job Guarantee. Now, they are related to young people who are coming from a universal credit background. So those that are NEET. We've then got foundation apprenticeships as an incentive for the next click, Anne-Marie. So £2,000 recruiting foundation apprenticeships if they're relevant. As we said, they've not seen huge amounts of take up. And actually, the one that I suspect is going to be a lot more interesting for a lot of employers, particularly the non-levy employers. So next click, and is they're introducing from October a hiring grant. So £2,000 for non-levy employers recruiting apprentices below the age of 25. Again, age related for younger people. Now, the dates here are important. So they'd have to be starting the practical period of their apprenticeship no earlier than the 1st of October. And I fear that's therefore going to drive some of the September starts we might expect back a few weeks. The other thing, and in fact, the funding rules came out just yesterday clarifying that it's only really for new hires, and they have to have been with the employer no more than, and they started saying 3 months, but they've now clarified it's 90 days. So basically anyone recruited in June will not be, that they'll have been at the employer for too long to actually be eligible for those. Very quickly on to the next slide. I'm sure most of you are very, very familiar with what happened in the budget. So some of these changes coming in from August. So on to the next point. If you're a non-levy employer, it's actually pretty good news. They've extended 100% funding for apprentices up to the age of 24. So as long as they're below 25, you get the 100% funding. Levy payers, though, with the next click, not as pleasant, unfortunately. Kind of quite, again, the government seems to think levy payers should bear the brunt of the costs. They reckon they've got quite broad shoulders. So removing the 10% government top up on contributions, expiry period going from 24 to 12 months, you've got to use your funds quicker. And actually, I think most importantly, particularly for those sorts of marginal levy payers with small pots, and in fact, I believe the stats show that about a quarter of levy payers have a pot of less than £6,000, which will barely cover one learner. They will very quickly potentially exhaust their pots and flick into the co-investment approach, where their rate will go from 5% currently to 25%. So a five-fold increase in their cost. I think that potentially is going to be the next level 7 in terms of the actual long-term repercussions. That's a big increase in cost. And next point, actually, just mention fiscal drag here. Because of, payrolls have been going up over the last few years, an awful lot of employers, I think there were 22,000 levy payers a few years ago. There's no more like 36,000. So I think there's an awful lot of organizations that will fall probably into that category. Well, I will stop rambling on there. That's probably my 15, and I was given a plus or minus 2 minutes. So, Anne-Marie, thank you very much for letting me run through that. I hope that was useful.
Thank you. Yeah, it was. And I'll just stop sharing Gareth's slides now. There's so much there to unpack, but I'm keen to get Joel and Lorcan's thoughts. But I've gotten several questions that have come in ahead of the webinar, which I'm happy to pose at the end. Keep putting them in the Q&A, as I say, and I will field all of those at the end. But Joel, I'm going to hand over to you now. I hear this a lot from members all the time, that there's a lot of the negatives and less of the positives. Government there's some real nuance in terminology, because this was always employer-led, right? And now we have the terminology of pro-employer. Now, I'll hand that over to you. Is it a pro-employer activity from your perspective now with all these reforms?
Great. Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. Good to see everyone here this afternoon. So why I'm here, ultimately, I'm here representing IBM to talk about how we are dealing with some of the change that we've seen in the apprenticeship landscape and how we're maximizing opportunities too in the apprenticeship space. So acknowledging it's a very, very dynamic environment. In terms of background, so IBM, for those that don't know, global technology organization. So we offer technology and consulting solutions across AI, cloud, quantum. And my role within the organization, I wear a couple of different hats. The first is I lead our employer provider program. So we are an approved provider of apprenticeships, and we have a level 4 offering, junior management consultant. So I lead that program, and then I also lead the degree apprenticeship program within the sales part of our business. So we employ apprentices across a range of different levels. We're employer provider for one particular part of our overall early professional offering. A little bit of context in terms of where we've been over the last few months. In January, we had an Ofsted inspection. So we were one of the first employer providers to be assessed against the new inspection toolkit. Really pleased to be able to share here that we came out of that, and we're really pleased with our results. We were strong, I guess, against each of the areas of that toolkit. I'm really fortunate to work for a company with a huge focus on learning, and this is at all levels. So if I take myself out of the kind of apprenticeship space as well for a moment, broadly as an organisation, every IBMer is expected to be upskilling or reskilling or pre-skilling. So we need to be growing current skills, parallel skills and future skills, because that's the technology landscape. We hire based on business demand each year, and we place huge importance in offering a ladder of opportunity for those that we recruit. So providing the opportunity to progress from one skills program to another. And over the next few minutes, I'm just going to pick up on a couple of kind of policy topics or changes most pertinent to our journey over the last 6 months, if that's okay. So I'm going to focus in particular on some of the revisions to standards and apprenticeship assessment, what I do know and what I don't know, what are some of the challenges that we're facing, and where have we been able to maximise opportunities to date. So in terms of apprenticeship standards then, so I was part of a recent trailblazer group. I'm going to use that term because I think it's what we're still familiar with. For the level 4 junior management consultant apprenticeship. So revising the standard. And we kicked this off in December, so end of 2025. And initially we had a completion date of by August 2026. That very quickly got brought forward 5 or 6 months, and we needed to complete that work by end of February, start of March. So very condensed time frame for redefining the standard, and there's some whole scale changes required there, and coming up with a new assessment plan. And my reflections on that experience of working with Skills England and with an employer group and working with assessment organisations was there was a real urgency to complete that work. That pace was very much set by Skills England, but was very much met by the range of organisations involved. In fact, I think it showed collaboration in its fullness. There was something very positive about engaging in that forum and being part of, whether we like the timeframes or not, being part of that solution. So there was great focus in that group and fantastic support from Skills England as well. So there was a product manager assigned to that group. There was some inflexibility in terms of the structure. So there was very clear areas that we could influence as a group. And then there were areas that were much harder for us to influence. So one of my reflections is some of the descriptors of what would constitute a pass versus a distinction, very little influence. And actually, we now have a dependency on some of the assessment organisations to help us interpret what that really means in practice. So the standard is now published with the caveat of this is still in revision. And since completing that work, our focus has really now transitioned to understanding assessment design. So following the publication of the standard, there's a 6-month window for us to be able to implement the program. So before new starters have to join that revised apprenticeship standard. That requires such close working with apprenticeship assessment organizations to understand assessment. So particularly with some of the recent changes in approach with an on-program element of assessment, optional assessment methods, and we really need to understand what assessment organizations are going to be doing to then be able to shape our program of learning. So there's a real dependency there that we're still working through. It does create a little bit of risk for providers, but fortunately for us, our current assessment organisation, CMI, have wanted to collaborate on early assessment design. So we've had conversations with them about what could that look like. So that's a positive. Again, another opportunity coming from some of the kind of pressure to see change implemented. When I think about assessment then, so this is the second area that I wanted to particularly focus on, because there's been so much change in this space. We acknowledge that we do have more options going forwards in terms of assessing apprentices. So the assessment organisation can continue to do 100% of that assessment, or we could apply to become an approved centre and do some of that assessment ourselves, taking on responsibility for delivering the assessment, marking the assessments, albeit under the oversight of the awarding assessment organisation. So we're in the early stages of exploring what that could look like. What I think we do know is that becoming a centre for apprenticeship assessment isn't as simple as just taking on the marking of learners. There's so much more involvement. And so when we kind of dig a little bit deeper, what we really see is it involves demonstrating the right qualities and competencies, showcasing that we have the right quality assurance in place, meeting external quality assurance and standards as well. A key consideration is also being able to demonstrate independence and how we manage conflict of interest in who we assess and how we assess. So it's a very integrated and governed process. So my initial view is that actually this could be a capacity challenge for organisations to deliver and become involved in. But regardless of whether we choose to do some of that assessment or whether it's delivered 100% by our chosen assessment organisation, the fact that more assessment is taking place during training, during the programme, this move away from endpoint assessment, that's a positive. more integration across the apprenticeship, less focus on that end point. So we hope that's a real positive for learners. We don't fully know what it's going to look like though. And I think the other biggest unknown to us at present is the change in how behaviours are assessed. And I use that word assessed very, very loosely, because we know that actually it's about employer validation. There's a level of uncertainty that remains in terms of the detail of what that looks like. What's the scope of employer's role? What effort is required to do that? And what does it actually look like in practice? As a large organization, behaviors are already very much explicitly assessed through our internal processes. So perhaps less of a pivot or a big ask for an organization that's already doing that. But many organizations, that's not going to be the case. And this is potentially a big ask in terms of effort for employers. So we're really keen to understand more about that validation process. Let's define validation versus assessment. Let's have a clear view of, is that signing off someone else's assessment, or is that owning the behaviours? So what's expected in practice? I think the jury's still out. What we don't want is behaviours to become a diluted part of the KSB overall assessment. The behaviours are absolutely integral to the apprenticeship and require the same level of validation as the Ks and S's. So there's a lot to stay on top of. It's very dynamic. And my kind of final encouragement or reflection really is that partnership has been key for us. So being part of industry groups like this, where you can connect with others, where you can have a voice and that voice will go somewhere, is really important. We're making space in our kind of regular internal management meetings to discuss policy and implications and risks, as well as opportunities, also really important. But also our relationships with assessment organizations. So what are they planning? There's a dependency there. So how do we collaborate and co-create together? And how can we also continue working with the trailblazer groups to be influencing going forward to make sure that our apprenticeships remain absolutely relevant to the learners enrolling? Anne-Marie, I'll hand back to you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Joel. Again, so a lot to unpack in that. A few things to point out to people on the call. Again, please post any more questions that you have. I've said I've got a few which I'll keep for the end. Don't forget that you can access previous ISE webinars. We ran a webinar on March the 25th with Carmel Grant from Skills England and Rob May, who is from an assessment organisation such as that you've just been describing, Joel. So Rob May from Innovate. There's still the recording of that. There's still the blog that I wrote, the sort of synopsis of that, which might help you. This is a complex world if you are relatively new to apprenticeships or perhaps relatively new to your role within your organisation. At the ISE, as well as the webinars and the information which I've described, we are running our Apprentice 101 course, which is a 3-module course. More information of that on our website. That's where I will, for the bits that Joel and Gareth have said in basically 30 minutes, there's 6 hours of really digging deep into that. So if people are going, this is like a really is too much of a whistle stop tour, absorb this, but do look to book on those other courses. Government will say that it has been driven by what employers wanted. The point that you have made, Joel, is that employers said that EPA was not working for them. It was administratively burdensome. It created a cliff edge. It was all about finishing at the end. And employers drove this on-programme assessment. As you've described, they also drove, or the groups that were consulted, drove the idea of skills being absorbed as a validation within performance review systems. But it's interesting when you talked about uncertainty, because when I said to Gareth, oh, we're entering a period of stability, you kind of said, no, we're not. And Joel is saying, yeah, I'm not sure about stable. So it is interesting that Skills England has achieved a lot, but there is still a lot of clarity that perhaps needs to be given. We've got another employer in the room. So Lorcan, I'm going to hand over to you now to give your perspective and your lens on what these reforms have meant for your business.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. So I'm hoping you can hear, can you see and hear me? Okay, good stuff.
I can see and hear you, yeah.
Okay, yeah, thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk today. So, hi everybody, my name's Lorcan Seery. I work for Irwin Mitchell. We're a law firm. We've got about 25 different offices around the UK. Before I started here in 2021, so just over 5 years ago, I've been involved in early careers and apprenticeships. Early careers for about 20 years and apprenticeships for about 15 years. So I've seen it seen lots of things happening, and it's been great to sort of be in this arena, learning and working with other partners like ISE and also with other employers as well, to try and navigate through an increasingly complex landscape. So yeah, what I was asked to talk about today was, given that we're a law firm, we've been quite severely impacted by the recent changes, not only generically where, Gareth was alluding to it, 10% top-up removals, all those sorts of levy changes, but equally, we introduced our solicitor apprenticeship offering in 2022. Of course, the age 22 restrictions impacted us quite heavily. And we also introduced our graduate solicitor offering as well in 2024. So we've had to navigate through, again, an increasingly complex path to work with our business, really, so we can, as simply as possible, outline what the changes are, what it means for the business, come up with some recommendations. And thankfully, we are getting through the treacle, making our sort of our recommendations known, and we are seeing light definitely at the end of the tunnel. So I've got just a few slides to work through in terms of basically what the sorts of things that I did. So if there are any employers out there, whether they're levy paying or non-levy paying, the sorts of approaches I took to basically grow our apprenticeship proposition, and also what that's meant for us now in terms of all those changes and where we're at. So I'm just going to share my screen. I'm hoping you'll be able to see them if you bear with me. Might give you a moment, sorry. Can you see Anne-Marie?
No, I can't. I haven't seen. You're not sharing at the moment.
Right, okay. Bear with me. Apologies. To just right, and that's the one. So here we go.
Yep.
Okay, so a little bit about Irwin Mitchell. Yeah, Irwin Mitchell, before I started, we introduced apprenticeships in 2016, so even before the levy became payable. In March, I joined a dedicated apprenticeship manager, and basically my remit was look and spend our levy, educate our workforce, inform our key stakeholders. What we saw was that before I joined, we were spending about 18% of our levy, and we're now forecast to basically overspend over 100% within the next sort of 12 months or so. Now, again, when I look at this sort of the latest ISE report, the development report, which is something I very much encourage you all to do. There's some fantastic stats and really reliable and strong MI data points available. It saw that the latest 2026 survey, 49% of all, average levy spend was 49% for all organisations and just 24% for UK law firms. So given we are, anticipating spending all of ours, one could say I've done a good job, but equally that's given us some challenges as well, which I'll cover off in a moment. So since 2021, we've started over 300 apprentices within our law firm. As I alluded to, we've got about 3,500 staff, 25 offices around the UK. And what I've really tried to do is basically using through the medium of obviously education and information sharing, dispelling an awful lot of myths. We've managed to increase our number of programs from 3 before I started to around 28. That's actually gone up now to around 29 during this time. I'm really pleased to say that whilst there's been an awful lot of growth, there've been very healthy completion rates. So 85% from our 2021 intake and 83% from our 2023 intake. Now, I always like to use figures and graphs because I think sometimes that just says what you see on the tin, basically. You can see here, look, we were spending the levy in 2017 and also where we're at now. So you can see here, it shows when I joined the line there, and it shows obviously an upward trajectory. With the introduction of graduate solicitor apprenticeships, this is where we bring trainees into our organisation. And rather than use our commercial, almost learning budget the decision was made by our organisation to basically put as many as we could through our apprenticeship, because again, we had levy funds there that we weren't using. So since 2024, we've brought in a number of trainees each year, and we put them on the apprenticeship. Now, what that's meant to us is that it's basically seen a saving from a commercial spend, so of about 1.6 million, because we're now about to have our third intake of trainee apprentice starting this year. Now, again, whilst that might be a positive outcome, you could argue it's not in the spirit for which the levy was intended. We very much now like to widen the opportunity to look at, again, our levy, look at basically how we're using our levy, look at our apprenticeship proposition, and see how much we can sort of review, monitor, and think about, okay, what do we need to do now to help future-proof Irwin Mitchell as an organisation? So I appreciate this is a bit of a busy slide, but I just thought it's a good summary to work through. So things I've done is, again, I've really wanted to partner with our HR business partners for those organisations that are fortunate to have them, rather than just do scattergun and go out and educate and inform and ask questions, very much in partnership with our HRBP community. And what I've tried to do is basically look at, delivering education and knowledge sharing sessions throughout our business. That's led to me dispelling an awful lot of myths. Some stakeholders thought it was just for internal colleagues, the levy. Others thought the opposite. It was just for, external colleagues. As a result of, attending an awful lot of meetings, delivering various presentations, I've been able to increase the number of apprenticeship programs from our colleagues, which I alluded to. We've now got apprenticeships at the forefront of our strategic growth plan. We've obtained an exec sponsor. And remember, what we've tried to do is to really promote both legal and non-legal apprenticeship options. Law, as you can probably appreciate, is a very, very appealing area for people to come into. But what a lot of school kids and teachers and schools don't know is that for big firms like ours, there's also a non-legal and other areas that they consider after leaving school. We've won some nice accolades. So what is now hiring, but was known as Rate My Apprenticeship when I started, I think we were 93rd or 98th. We rose up to 79 places. So we got to 14th within the space of 3 years. And that was based on anonymous surveys from our current apprenticeship. So that's something I, take an awful lot of pride to, because since I joined, fortunately, my role is predominantly apprenticeships, although I support a lot of the graduates as well. But I've got the time and resource to really think about what our proposition should look like. We're aligned to business and future needs now, so we're having conversations constantly about upskilling, reskilling opportunities, because the very best people we have, if there's been a change in direction for them as a career pathway, we very much want to try and retain those people. What we've also found is the quality of programme has helped future-proof IM. So again, for those high potential colleagues, we've been having specific conversations with those individuals about, well, look, what career development options there are, and maybe an apprenticeship might be wise for you, it might be the right move. So again, having in-depth discussions with those apprentices and their line managers to think about suitability of programs. And that's been great. We've been working with people right from sort of level 3 intakes, but working with experienced colleagues. We've got some people who've done master's apprenticeships at Cranfield, Northumbria University, etc. So it's been great to have the time to build up those conversations and have something appealing and really meaningful for those colleagues to move into. We promote apprenticeships at every given opportunity. One of the things I'm constantly hearing is, you can only be what you can see. So we're very much wanted to use, a number of our colleagues within our external collateral to promote, you can be what you can see. So if you're from an ethnic minority or a certain minority group, then we really do try our best to promote that. If you can be what you can see, then there's a reality in terms of a pathway that you can try and aspire to join. We train managers to help provide a positive experience, and that's a lot of my role about that pastoral care. I predominantly look at those school leavers who might not have any work experience before, but I work very closely with them, with their managers and our training providers to make sure they all get a meaningful sort of, training experience so they can provide the best experience for their apprentices as well. I've built up excellent relationships with training providers, and we're just at the point now where we're revisiting our contracts to make sure we've got, a good idea in terms of what we can do, if anything, to make sure we can, use economies of scale with our training providers to deliver those training programs as efficiently and effectively as possible. We see as well the fact we've got 25 different offices. It's a great opportunity we have as a firm, and I've really tried to play on this to capitalise on this. That we've got a number of offices around the country, And what better way is there to recruit those people from the communities in which we serve? So we do try to do an awful lot of outreach, promotion about these local opportunities, and the fact that they don't have to travel to a main headquarters in London, which for some people, might be unobtainable for a whole host of different reasons. We very much want to use our multi-site location as one of our key USPs. All our apprentices start on the real living wage, so that pays for our 16-year-olds who join us as business admin apprentices. We pay £470 a week, up to £518. So they're not on this minimum wage of sometimes what you used to see was around £100 a week. I think they're fairly good salaries for 16 and 18-year-olds, and that only goes up year on year. We've also found some positive differential around EDI versus graduate trainees. One of our biggest differentials we've found is where we've seen 40% more trainees had parents who attended university versus our apprenticeship solicitors. So it just goes to show that we want to definitely do more in this space, but even the fact that our apprentice solicitors who join us generally from school, they've not had that support and that experience of their parents going to university. So they may well have been the first time, obviously, that they've attended work, but they haven't had parents who've had that university experience. We also want to promote the amount of national insurance that we've been able to not pay. That's reached just over 450,000 now. We've also received £100,000 received in levy incentives since I joined in 2021. What's great now, given the fact that I'm 5 years in, we've got proven progression pathways for our people. And that's often one of the things that a lot of young people who are looking for work are looking to really find out about joining firms where they want to see real progression. They don't just want to come in on a 1 or 2 year contract. There's progression pathways. And it's fantastic to see that, a large majority of our paralegal apprentices who join from the age of 18, a large majority of them go on to secure a solicitor apprentice. So from the age of sort of 18, they could become qualified solicitors without any debt, where we'll pay for them to do the law degree and the trainee qualifications in the space of 6 years, and they'll have zero debt. What better way is there to then promote these opportunities? I introduced the solicitor apprenticeship, which basically pays for those qualifications. So somebody straight from school can become a qualified lawyer without any debt within the space of 6 years. We also introduced the graduate solicitor apprenticeship opportunity within 2024. We also capitalise on things like National Apprenticeship Week to help promote our apprenticeships both internally and externally. Again, because of the role that I do, I'm conducting regular communal surgery calls where we have apprentices on one, where I encourage them to join. We talk about any concerns, queries, what's happening within their worlds, and also celebrate successes. And I do that as well for line managers, because again, some of these are very new to managing young people, and sometimes there is a different type of support that's very much needed for these people whose experience into the world of employment might be the very first time here at Irwin Mitchell. I also have fantastic internal engagement, which is really a nice part of the job. I have repeat line managers who've really enjoyed taking on young people and seeing them grow, really enjoying that nurturing experience. And that's really helped sort of grow our apprenticeship proposition. We've also got a robust internal comms program. We showcase opportunities, although we've paused at the moment, and I'll come on to that a little bit later in terms of what offerings we have. We partner with primes, so do an awful lot of work with third-party organisations and charities to really promote concentrating opportunities and promoting those opportunities for those individuals from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. Thankfully, we've been able to see a bonus in terms of our paralegals on an apprenticeship. We've seen a high 15% higher retention rate for those of the people who come in as paralegals. And also we've developed an internal talent and value add through, IM upskilling opportunities, where we've had very fruitful discussions with managers and colleagues to really think about, what we can do to support those high potential colleagues as well through an apprenticeship. We also encourage robust outreach activities to help educate teachers, schools, etc., to really promote that. University might not be for some people, and apprenticeships might not be for some young people. But what I found certainly in the last 10 years is that still enough students, schools aren't promoting enough about alternatives to university, such as apprenticeships. So where are we now? Again, with all the levy changes, that's been sort of covered already. We are being quite cautious with our levy approach at the moment. So we've paused internal offerings for now, and that potential to upskill just until we get to maybe the autumn time, September, and we can really truly see basically where our levy pot is at. We will still anticipate taking on an external intake, anything between 15 and 30 apprentices each year, but we just want to exercise some caution at the moment. But hopefully what that will mean is that we're in a good space then to start promoting and agreeing our numbers then for 2027 and beyond. We're testing a more robust levy spending monitoring process. I'm working very closely with my finance head to really think about, right, okay, where are we specifically at now with the changes from a 2-year expiry date to 1 year from August? You know, we are having to pay an awful lot of attention, as I know a lot of employers are, in terms of what does this mean for us in the levy space, you know, because the last thing we want to do is to obviously exhaust our levy wherever possible, because it means obviously a higher co-investment rate. We're now working, I've embarked on agreeing a new apprenticeship strategy review within our business. So I had my first meeting yesterday. That will comprise of a number of consultations with HRBPs, senior stakeholders within our business to think about, look, this is where we've been getting to with our apprenticeship strategy for now, but what can we do better? Very much hoping that we'll be able to concentrate more so using our levy on skills and capability gaps, and also what our business priorities and skills needs are to help future-proof our organisation. We'll be hopefully aligning it more effectively to workforce planning requirements, because again, that's ever changing, but we want to get to a steady state and, you know, real stable rate in terms of what can we use our apprenticeship levy for, both internally and externally, to help make sure we equip our business for future success. Thankfully, we've got healthy completion and retention rates. 35% of our apprentice cohorts are internal colleagues, and that's sometimes through promotion, through paralegal to solicitor apprenticeship, or simply just apprenticeship colleagues using apprenticeships to upskill. Thankfully, this year, with the introduction of the levy change funding for level 7s, obviously quite severely impacted our offering. So we managed to agree, the board, to still recruit a number of solicitor apprentices, and we would pay for that regardless of their age, which is fantastic news. We've got a stricter levy application process currently being considered for all colleagues because of our levy almost caution at the moment. But again, we are monitoring that almost month on month. We've introduced a robust tendering exercise with our bigger training providers, because we just want to make sure that we've got the best training providers and we can agree the best sort of rates for our programs. So that's still ongoing at the moment. We're reviewing if we can make apprenticeships more flexible around intake dates. So that's something that we're aligning to our apprentice strategy. And finally, we're considering expanding into emerging skills areas. So looking at things like apprenticeship skills units, certainly in the AI space. Now that's really sort of in a whistle-stop tour, the sorts of things that I've had to help navigate up to now. So I hope that sort of helps just educate some of the employers on there. There might be some of the things that you've done similarly, but again, for those non-levy paying employees, it might give you a little food for thought as well. Thanks, Anne-Marie.
Thank you, Lorcan. Thanks very much. I mean, there is a lot of detail here, and that's why I've said, you know, please feel free to message me at any time. I am the ISE lead on apprenticeships, and more than happy to answer your questions. Joel, Lorcan, Gareth and myself were all part of the Apprentice Champions group, and we will always welcome a steer from members as to what they'd like to hear more of, what they feel we could expand on. There's been lots of questions that have been raised with me over the last few weeks. I'm just going to wrap it all up into one, because I'm conscious that we only have 5 minutes left. I'm going to play devil's advocate. I will hear members say that the apprenticeship levy is a business tax. It is. We have no option but to pay it. It's a business tax, just like any other business tax. That money goes into Treasury. A much smaller amount comes out of Treasury into DWP and DFE, and it enables us to draw on that funding. But increasingly, it's to draw on it in the way that government wants us to spend it. Gareth, I'll come to you first. Is that a jaundiced, unfair view, or does that bear any relation to the actual reality now in 2026?
I mean, I think it's a very realistic, pragmatic view, but that doesn't necessarily mean there aren't benefits to be drawn from it. I think, you know, yes, a lot of employers are viewing it as a tax, levy payers, obviously. You know, and it's almost become a victim of its own success. You know, the fact that it's fully spent or even slightly overspent is actually because apprenticeships are very successful, and they are doing for a lot of sectors and a lot of employers what they're supposed to do. I mean, in my sector in accountancy, they've been hugely successful, and have actually empowered a lot of social mobility as well as the growth in talent that it's fueled for organisations. But it's clear you have to lean into the government priorities. And I do fear that if employers don't lean into the government priorities around NEETs and around young people and around the industrial strategy, I fear we're going to see even bigger trade-offs coming down the line. So it's a matter of recognizing it for what it is, but also being conscious of the benefits that a lot of employers can gain from it.
Thanks, Gareth. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we hear ever more about these trade-offs, and particularly, I guess, now in the political climate of the squeeze on funding for anything else in terms of the extra funding for defence. I mean, this is only going to go in one direction. Joel, just quickly coming to you. IBM is a big recruiter of apprentices. As you say, it is also the training provider. Apprenticeship still a big thing for IBM, a big business priority, would you say, Joel?
Yeah, absolutely remains a big priority. We are very actively recruiting at the moment. They're a key part of our kind of workforce model. The ladder of opportunity remains absolutely integral to us. So bringing people in, offering them more than a program, offering them routes into further upskilling as well. So yes is my one word answer.
Thank you. And we are running out of time. Lorcan, you've spoken a lot about the sort of maxing your levy share. As Lorcan already referred to in his presentation, our ISE data will tell us in our development survey that it was 49% of the levy was spent by employers. I think the most recent statistic I looked at nationally was about 51%. There are obviously, as Gareth has described, the trade-offs that now that you have to spend it in 12 months, not 24, if you max out on your spending too early, you may run the risk then of going into that co-investment funding at 25%. As I said, Lorcan is an apprentice champion. So if you've got any questions that you want to ask about, well, how did you spend all of that levy money and still manage to sort of stay within the budgets that you were given, please direct them at me and I will direct them back through the Apprentice Champion group. So just want to say a big thank you to our three presenters, Joel, Gareth and Lorcan. Thank you all very much for joining the webinar. I've left my email address in the chat, which you can follow up with any direct questions. Don't forget the Apprentice 101 course. We've also got an employer forum, not just about apprenticeships, an employer forum on the 29th of June, which is being held here in London, hosted at Clifford Chance, which is all around what do we do in a world where our budgets are shrinking, our capacities are shrinking, and we're being asked to do even more with less. So if you'd like to join that conversation, please join me and my team, and we will be happy to see you on the 29th. But thank you all so much for joining. Hope you found it interesting, and we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Anne-Marie.
Thank you.